The harsh fluorescent lights of the military courtroom cast long shadows across the metal floor as Colonel Kim Tae-min adjusted his uniform and took his seat behind the judge's bench. Outside the reinforced windows of forward operating base Taijin, the red dust of the alien planet swirled in the thin atmosphere. The year 2157 had brought humanity deep into space, but it had also brought war. Kim looked down at the case files spread before him. Another disciplinary hearing. Another soldier, who thought they knew better than regulations. He sighed and straightened his shoulders. Order and discipline were what kept the Terran forces alive out here. Thousands of light years from Earth, fighting an enemy that seemed to know every human weakness. The courtroom door hissed open, and Lieutenant Colonel Lee Na-young entered. With her escort, Kim barely glanced up from his papers as she walked to the defendant's table. Her uniform was crisp, despite being in the field for months, her posture straight and military. But Kim had already made up his mind about this case. Unauthorized weapon deployment was serious business, especially during wartime. The prosecutor, Major Park Jin-ho, stood and read the charges in a clear voice that echoed off the metal walls. Lieutenant Colonel Lee Na-young stands accused of deploying experimental weapon systems without proper authorization during the Battle of Kepler Station, in direct violation of Terran Military Code Section 847. Kim nodded curtly. How does the defendant plead? Lee Na-young rose to her feet. Not guilty, sir. I request permission to explain the circumstances. The circumstances are irrelevant, Kim replied coldly. You either had authorization or you did not. The record shows you did not. But Lee Na-young continued anyway, her voice steady despite the obvious futility. Sir, civilian evacuation ship Harmony was under direct attack by Centauri raiders. The ship carried 15,000 refugees from the mining colonies. Standard defensive systems had failed. Without immediate action, every soul on that ship would have died. Kim tapped his stylus against his desk impatiently. The Centauri were humanity's greatest enemy in this sector, alien beings who seemed to take particular pleasure in targeting defenseless civilians. But that did not excuse breaking military protocol. Lieutenant Colonel, you were given specific orders to maintain defensive positions around the station. You were not authorized to deploy experimental technology that had not been fully tested. Your actions endangered not only your own unit, but potentially the entire operation. Lee Na-young's jaw tightened slightly, but her voice remained controlled. Sir, the prototype energy shields I deployed worked exactly as designed. They created a protective barrier that allowed the Harmony to escape. Every single civilian survived. That is beside the point, Kim snapped. Military discipline exists for a reason. If every officer decided to ignore orders and use untested equipment whenever they felt like it, we would have chaos. The Centauri would crush us within weeks. The military AI system in the corner of the room hummed quietly as it recorded every word, every gesture, every decision. Its sensors measured stress levels, vocal patterns, and facial expressions. Later, military analysts would review these recordings for patterns, looking for signs of weakness or corruption that enemies might exploit. Major Park presented the evidence methodically. Combat logs showed that Lee Na-young had indeed deployed experimental shield generators without going through proper channels. Communications records proved she had received direct orders to maintain her position. Technical reports indicated the shields could have malfunctioned catastrophically, potentially destroying the very ship she was trying to save. When it came time for Lee Na-young to present her defense, she stood calmly and spoke about the tactical situation. The Centauri raiders had used a new type of plasma weapon that cut through standard shields like paper. Conventional defenses were useless. The evacuation ship was seconds away from being destroyed when she made her decision. I had a choice, she said simply. Follow orders and watch 15,000 innocent people die, or take a calculated risk to save them. I chose to save them. Kim felt his patience wearing thin. Your choice was to obey orders or face the consequences of disobedience. This tribunal exists to ensure those consequences are applied fairly and consistently. The evidence was clear. The violation was obvious. Kim had presided over dozens of similar cases, and the outcome was always the same. Military discipline could not be compromised, especially during wartime. When the time came for sentencing, Kim stood and delivered his judgment in a voice that carried the full weight of military authority. Lieutenant Colonel Lee Na-young, this tribunal finds you guilty of unauthorized deployment of experimental weapons systems. You are hereby reduced in rank to major and forfeit 6 months' pay. This sentence will be entered into your permanent record. Lee Na-young accepted the verdict without visible emotion, snapping to attention and saluting crisply before being escorted from the courtroom. As the room emptied, Kim gathered his files and prepared for the next case. Outside, the alien sun was setting, casting strange purple shadows across the military base. The war continued, as it had for 3 long years with no end in sight. The AI system continued its quiet recording, documenting another day in the long struggle between order and chaos, between following rules and making impossible choices in the depths of space. The evening air on forward operating base Taejon carried the scent of recycled atmosphere and distant engine exhaust as Kim Tae-min walked across the parade ground toward the Academy Ceremony Hall. He had changed from his judge's uniform into his dress blues, the medals on his chest catching the artificial lights that illuminated the military complex. Tonight was special. His daughter, Sora, was graduating from the Terran Space Academy's Advanced Officer Program. Kim felt a rare smile cross his face as he thought about Sora. She had always been determined, even as a child back on Earth. When the war started, she had insisted on joining the military despite his protests. Now she was about to become a full captain in the Terran Defense Forces. He was proud, though. He would never admit how much he worried about her safety in this dangerous galaxy. The ceremony hall buzzed with conversation as families and fellow officers gathered for the graduation. Kim found his seat in the front row, reserved for immediate family of the graduates. Around him sat other parents, some in military uniforms, others in civilian clothes who had traveled incredible distances across space to be here for their children. The lights dimmed, and the ceremony began with the traditional military honors. The Academy Commandant spoke about duty and sacrifice, about the challenges facing humanity in the outer colonies. Kim had heard these speeches many times before, but tonight they felt more personal. His own daughter would soon be facing those same challenges. When the time came for the graduates to be introduced, Kim watched with growing pride as young officers stepped forward to receive their commissions. Each was introduced by their commanding officer or mentor, someone who had guided them through their final training missions. Captain Kim Sora, the announcer called out, and Kim's daughter stepped forward in her crisp new uniform. She looked confident and professional, every inch the space officer she had trained to become. But when Kim looked up to see who would be introducing his daughter, his blood ran cold. Walking onto the stage was Lieutenant Colonel Lee Na-young, the same woman he had demoted just hours earlier in his courtroom, the woman whose career he had just damaged with his harsh sentence. Lee Na-young stepped to the microphone, her bearing still proud despite the morning's proceedings. She looked out at the audience, her eyes briefly meeting Kim's before she began to speak. "I have had the honor of serving as mentor to Captain Kim Sora during her final training deployment," Lee Na-young said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall. "She is an exceptional officer who has already proven herself in combat." Kim felt his stomach tighten. Combat. His daughter had been in actual fighting. Lee Na-young continued. "During the siege of Vega Prime, Captain Kim showed remarkable courage and leadership. When our defensive positions were overrun by Centauri forces, she took command of a mixed unit of Marines and engineers. For 6 days and nights, they held the evacuation zones while civilian transports escaped the planet." The audience listened intently as Lee Na-young described the battle. Kim had heard reports about Vega Prime, but he had not known his daughter was there. The siege had been one of the most desperate fights of the war, with Centauri raiders attempting to capture the entire civilian population of the mining world. "On the 4th day of the siege, our communications were cut and our supply lines broken," Lee Na-young said. "Captain Kim made the decision to redistribute our remaining ammunition and medical supplies to ensure the wounded could be evacuated first. She personally led 3 separate rescue missions into contested territory to recover trapped civilians." Kim stared at his daughter, seeing her in a completely new light. The young woman on the stage was not just his little girl anymore. She was a combat veteran who had saved lives under the most dangerous conditions imaginable. But Lee Na-young was not finished. When Centauri assault troops broke through our final defensive line, Captain Kim coordinated the last evacuation transport while remaining behind to cover the withdrawal. She and her unit held their position until the very last transport cleared the atmosphere. The hall was completely quiet now, everyone absorbed in the story of the siege. Kim found himself leaning forward, desperate to hear every detail of his daughter's actions. In total, the defensive actions led by Captain Kim and her unit saved over 50,000 civilian lives, Lee Na-young concluded. The evacuation of Vega Prime was successful because young officers like her were willing to make impossible choices under extreme pressure. As Lee Na-young spoke those final words, Kim felt a terrible understanding wash over him. The same qualities that had made his daughter a hero at Vega Prime were the same qualities that had led Lee Na-young to deploy those experimental shields at Kepler Station. Both women had faced impossible situations where following orders meant watching innocent people die. The ceremony continued, but Kim barely heard the rest of it. He watched his daughter receive her captain's commission, watched her shake hands with the Academy Commandant, watched her smile proudly at the audience. But all he could think about was the woman who had trained her, the woman whose career he had damaged that very morning. When the ceremony ended and families began to mingle with the graduates, Kim approached his daughter with mixed feelings of pride and guilt weighing heavily on his mind. Kim Tae-min could not sleep that night. He lay in his small quarters staring at the metal ceiling, thinking about his daughter's graduation ceremony and the woman who had trained her. The same woman he had sentenced that morning now seemed like a completely different person. He kept hearing Lee Na-young's words about the siege, about the impossible choices young officers had to make. Finally, Kim gave up trying to sleep. He put on his uniform and walked through the quiet corridors of the base to his office. The night shift. Personnel nodded respectfully as he passed, but he barely noticed them. His mind was focused on one thing. He needed to see Lee Na-young's complete military record. Kim's office was dark and cold when he entered. He activated his computer terminal and entered his access codes. As a military judge, he had clearance to review any service member's file, but he had never bothered to look beyond the basic information needed for tribunal cases. Tonight would be different. Lee Na-young's service record appeared on his screen, and Kim began to read. What he found made his hands shake slightly as he scrolled through page after page of commendations, battle reports, and strategic analyses. The Mao record began 8 years earlier, when Lee Na-young had graduated from the Engineering Academy with the highest honors in her class. Her first assignment had been to the outer colony worlds, where Centauri raiders were just beginning to probe human defenses. Even as a young lieutenant, she had shown exceptional skill in defensive engineering. Kim read about her first major engagement at the Battle of Titan's Edge, where she had designed improvised fortifications that allowed a small human garrison to hold off a much larger Centauri force. Her innovations had been so effective that they became standard defensive doctrine throughout the Terran forces. The record continued with battle after battle. New Carthage, where she had developed the shield rotation tactics that saved the orbital stations, the asteroid belt campaign, where her mobile defense platforms had protected the mining operations that supplied the entire war effort. Proxima Station, where she had personally led the engineering teams that repaired critical systems while under enemy fire. Kim counted them as he read: 12 major battles, dozens of smaller engagements, and countless strategic innovations that had shaped how humanity fought the war. Lee Na-young was not just another officer who had broken regulations. She was one of the most important military minds of her generation. But the more Kim read, the worse he felt about his judgment that morning. The reports painted a picture of an officer who consistently found creative solutions to impossible problems. Time and again, she had been faced with situations where standard procedures would have failed, and time and again, she had found ways to save lives and achieve victory. The report on the Kepler Station incident filled Kim with growing horror as he read the full details. The Centauri Alliance had not simply stumbled upon the evacuation ship by accident. Intelligence reports showed that they had specifically planned to target civilian transports as part of a new strategy to break human morale. The evacuation ship Harmony had been carrying refugees from 3 different colony worlds that had been attacked in the previous weeks. 15,000 men, women, and children were packed into a vessel designed for half that number. When the Centauri raiders appeared, the ship's captain had sent a desperate message. Their engines were damaged, their shields were failing, and they could not escape. Li Na-young had been in command of the defensive platforms around Kepler Station when the attack began. Standard protocol called for her to protect the station itself, not to risk her forces for individual ships. But as Kim read the tactical analysis, he began to understand the impossible choice she had faced. The Centauri had brought new weapons to the battle, plasma cannons that could cut through normal shields like they were made of paper. The Harmony was defenseless against them. In less than 2 minutes, the largest civilian massacre in the war's history would have taken place. The experimental shield generators that Li Na-young had deployed were prototypes that had never been tested in actual combat. The technical reports warned that they could malfunction catastrophically, possibly destroying everything within a kilometer radius. Using them violated every safety protocol in the military manual, but they had worked perfectly. The new shields had created a protective barrier around the Harmony that the Centauri weapons could not penetrate. The evacuation ship had escaped safely, carrying 15,000 civilians to safety. More importantly, the successful defense had shown other Centauri commanders that their new weapons were not invincible, forcing them to abandon their strategy of targeting civilian transports. Kim stared at the screen, reading the final assessment of the Kepler Station battle. Military analysts had calculated that Li Na-young's actions had not only saved those 15,000 lives, but had also prevented the Centauri from achieving their goal of terrorizing human civilians. Her violation of regulations had actually strengthened human morale and changed the course of the entire war. As dawn began to break over the alien landscape outside his office window, Kim realized the full weight of what he had done. He had punished one of humanity's greatest war heroes for the very act of heroism that had helped save the war effort. The woman he had demoted was not a reckless officer who ignored orders, but a brilliant strategist who had consistently found ways to protect innocent lives. Kim closed the file and sat back in his chair, feeling the burden of his mistake settling heavily on his shoulders. 3 days after the tribunal, Kim Tae-min was reviewing case files in his office when his communication device buzzed with an urgent message. The sender was General Park Hyun-woo, the base commander, and the message was brief but alarming. "Report to my office immediately. Bring all records from the Li Na-young case." Kim felt his stomach drop as he gathered the files. Something was very wrong. He had been a military judge for 5 years, and he had never been summoned to explain a routine disciplinary case. As he walked through the corridors toward the general's office, he noticed other officers whispering in small groups, their conversations stopping when they saw him approach. General Park's office was crowded when Kim arrived. The general sat behind his desk looking grim, while 3 other officers stood nearby. Kim recognized them as the base intelligence officer, the communications chief, and the legal affairs director. None of them looked happy to see him. "Colonel Kim," General Park said without any greeting, "we have a serious problem. The recordings from your tribunal 3 days ago have been leaked to military intelligence networks across the sector." Kim's blood ran cold. All military tribunals were recorded for review purposes, but those recordings were supposed to be classified. "Leaked, sir? How is that possible?" The intelligence officer, Major Song Min-ho, stepped forward with a data pad in his hand. "We believe the leak came from within our own systems. Someone with high-level access copied the files and transmitted them to multiple locations throughout the Terran Defense Forces. But more importantly," General Park continued, "these recordings are now being used by Centauri intelligence agents as propaganda material. They are claiming that human military leadership is corrupt and biased, that we punish our own heroes while incompetent officers remain in command." Kim felt the room spinning around him. Sir, I was simply enforcing military regulations. Lieutenant Colonel Lee violated clear orders about experimental weapons. That's not how it looks to the rest of the galaxy, the communications chief, Colonel Choi Soo-jin, said sharply. The recordings show you dismissing the testimony of one of our most decorated combat veterans. They show you ignoring the fact that she saved 15,000 civilian lives. To outside observers, it looks like you punished her for being too successful. Major Song activated his datapad, and a holographic display appeared in the center of the room. It showed intercepted Centauri communications translated into human language. Kim read the messages with growing horror. Human command structure weak, one message read. Their own judges attack successful officers. Division in leadership confirmed. Proceed with final offensive plans. Another message was even more damaging. Broadcast tribunal recordings to all sectors. Show humans that their heroes are treated as criminals. Morale collapse inevitable. The timing could not be worse, General Park said grimly. Peace negotiations with the Centauri Alliance are scheduled to begin next week. Our diplomats were hoping to negotiate from a position of strength, but now the enemy thinks we are weak and divided. Kim stared at the messages, realizing that his tribunal decision was being used as evidence that humanity was not fit to control the outer colonies. The Centauri were arguing that if humans could not even treat their own heroes fairly, how could they be trusted to govern alien populations? There's more, Major Song continued. Intelligence reports indicate that similar tribunal recordings are being leaked from other bases throughout the sector. It appears that several other decorated officers have faced questionable disciplinary actions in recent months. Colonel Choi brought up another display, showing cases from different military bases. Kim saw familiar patterns: combat veterans facing charges for tactical decisions made under extreme pressure, experienced officers being punished for innovations that had saved lives, heroes being treated as criminals for making difficult choices. We believe this is part of a coordinated intelligence operation, Major Song explained. The Centauri have been monitoring our military justice system, waiting for cases they could use to make us look incompetent and divided. And you, Colonel Kim, gave them exactly what they were looking for, General Park said coldly. Your harsh treatment of one of our most respected officers has become a symbol of everything the Centauri claim is wrong with human leadership. Kim felt sick as he realized the implications. His decision to punish Lena Young was not just affecting one officer's career. It was being used to undermine the entire human war effort at the most critical moment in the conflict. What makes this worse, Colonel Choi added, is that Lena Young has become something of a folk hero among the enlisted personnel. They see her as someone who puts saving lives above following rules. When word spreads that she was punished for her heroism, it could damage morale throughout the entire fleet. The intelligence officer showed Kim more intercepted communications. Centauri agents were already spreading the tribunal recordings through underground networks, accompanied by messages claiming that human officers were more interested in enforcing petty rules than winning the war. The enemy is using your tribunal as proof that humanity is not ready for galactic leadership, General Park concluded. They are arguing that a species that punishes its own heroes for saving lives cannot be trusted with the responsibility of governing other worlds. Kim looked around the room at the faces of his fellow officers, seeing disappointment and anger in their expressions. His single decision in a routine disciplinary case had somehow become a weapon in the enemy's hands, threatening to undermine everything humanity had fought for in 3 years of bloody war. Kim Tae-min stood before the assembled officers of Forward, Operating Base Taijon, his hands trembling slightly as he held the prepared statement. The main briefing hall was packed with personnel from every unit on the base, and he could see the skeptical faces staring back at him. Word had already spread about the leaked tribunal recordings and the damage they had caused to the war effort. 3 days ago, I made a decision that I believed was correct, Kim began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. I sentenced Lieutenant Colonel Lee Na-young for violating military regulations. Today I am here to publicly reverse that decision and to apologize for my error in judgment. A murmur ran through the crowd. Military judges rarely reversed their decisions, and public apologies were almost unheard of. Kim saw surprise and confusion on many faces, but he also saw hope in others. After reviewing the complete service record of Lieutenant Colonel Lee Young, I have concluded that her actions at Kepler Station were not violations of military discipline, but examples of the highest form of military leadership. She saved 15,000 civilian lives by making a difficult decision under extreme pressure. Kim paused and looked directly at Lee Na-young, who was standing at attention in the front row. I formally restore Lieutenant Colonel Lee to her, full rank and privileges, with all charges dismissed. Furthermore, I recommend her for the Terran Defense Cross for her actions at Kepler Station. The applause that followed was thunderous. Officers throughout the hall stood and clapped, many of them smiling for the first time in days. Kim felt some of the weight lifting from his shoulders, but he knew this was only the beginning of what needed to be done. Over the following weeks, Kim worked directly with Lee Na-young to examine the military justice system throughout the sector. They discovered that his tribunal was not an isolated incident. Dozens of combat veterans had been punished for making tactical decisions that had ultimately saved lives and won battles. The problem is that our regulations were written for peacetime, Lee Na-young explained as they reviewed case files in Kim's office. In actual combat, officers must make split-second decisions with incomplete information. If we punish everyone who deviates from the manual, we will lose the war. Kim nodded grimly. But how do we maintain discipline while allowing for tactical flexibility? We judge results, not just procedures, Lee Na-young replied. If an officer breaks regulations but saves lives and achieves the mission, that should be considered in any disciplinary action. They worked together to draft new guidelines for military justice that would account for the realities of modern warfare. Kim found himself impressed by Lee Na-young's analytical mind and her deep understanding of military law. She was not just a brilliant combat officer, but also a thoughtful strategist who understood the complex balance between discipline and flexibility. Their partnership became a symbol of the changes happening throughout the Terran Defense Forces. Word spread that the harsh judge and the war hero were working together to reform the system that had nearly destroyed both their careers. Morale began to improve as officers realized that their sacrifices and difficult decisions would be fairly evaluated. But the Centauri Alliance was not content to wait for human reforms to take effect. Intelligence reports indicated that enemy forces were massing for a major offensive, believing that human command was still fractured and weak. The leaked tribunal recordings had convinced Centauri leadership that humanity was on the verge of internal collapse. The attack came without warning on a Tuesday morning. Centauri battle fleets appeared simultaneously in 12 different star systems, launching coordinated strikes against military bases and civilian targets. The enemy had committed their entire remaining fleet to this final offensive, gambling everything on their belief that human forces would be too divided to mount an effective defense. Kim was in his office reviewing legal reforms when the attack alerts began screaming throughout the base. He rushed to the command center, where General Park was coordinating the defense with his staff officers. The tactical displays showed Centauri forces advancing on multiple fronts, their ships moving with confidence toward their objectives. They're heading straight for Earth, General Park announced grimly. This is their final push. If they can capture our homeworld, the war is over. Kim found Lee Na-young in the command center, studying the tactical displays with intense concentration. She had been promoted to full colonel just days earlier, and now she was being asked to help coordinate the defense of humanity's most important world. The enemy is making a mistake, Lee Na-young said quietly to Kim as they watched the battle reports coming in. They think we are weak and divided, but they are wrong. The reforms we have been working on have actually made our forces stronger. How? So? Kim asked. Officers throughout the fleet now know that innovative thinking will be rewarded, not punished. They will take risks and make bold decisions because they trust that their leadership will support them. Over the next 72 hours, Kim watched as Lee Na-young's prediction proved correct. Human forces fought with creativity and determination, using unconventional tactics that confused and frustrated the Centauri commanders. Officers who might have followed outdated procedures in the past now adapted quickly to changing battle conditions. The defense of Earth became the turning point of the entire war. When the Centauri Alliance finally sued for peace, their surrender, documents specifically mentioned the unexpected unity and effectiveness of human military leadership as factors in their defeat.